this function of corporate ethics, corporate responsibility, social responsibility is always located at the public relations level. And the public relations level is really in an extended marketing function in many contexts. So is it close to the management? Yes, public relations is normally very close to management from an organizational perspective. But does it have to do with the actual leadership? Absolutely not. It is just a function that really is public relations. It is a communication function to the outside. And it has nothing to do with actually putting these things and making them reality on the inside. Obviously, once you see the report and you see, okay, you're really doing a bad job, then of course the motivation for management will be to do this or the other thing to make it look better. But that's really the motivation, to make it look better.
Coming right at you. PM Cowboy Podcast. Hi, this is your PM Cowboy coming back to you with one of our podcasts. I think it's number 33. We've got a great topic today and a great guest, Sascha Mundstein. We'll introduce him in just a moment. One of the missions of our podcast is to provide our community of project managers, senior managers, executive managers, and all of those who want to become that, interesting content on management and leadership challenges that we have. We kind of separated into two different categories: the management side, which is more process-oriented, and then the leadership side, which is the higher level thinking, the more cognitive, I won't say esoteric, but valuable philosophical aspect. And this podcast is dedicated to leadership. In specific, what we're going to be talking about today is ethics in leadership. Okay, some of you might be rolling your eyes and saying, oh my God, isn't that a misnomer? Does that even exist? We believe it does, and we believe that it has purpose and value. And that's kind of what we're going to try to convince you of today. I met Sascha recently at a dinner party, and we were talking about solving the problems of the world. We almost solved them all, didn't we?
Indeed, we did.
We did, right? And we turned onto one of my topics that's a favorite of mine, and that is the concept of corporate social responsibility. All right. We talked about corporate social responsibility, ESG, SDG, all these wonderful acronyms that are out there. And you smiled at me and said, I think something to the effect, yeah, that doesn't seem to be working. I've got a better solution, right? And I said, great, after discussing it for a little bit. That's why I have him here as a guest today. Sascha, do you want to introduce yourself real quick so that our viewers have an idea a little bit about your background? You're kind of a polymath, so you're difficult to put into one box, which I love about our guests. You're a classical, I guess, PM Cowboy in that sense, that you're all over the place. But maybe some of the highlights of your past history, so people know, how did you come up with ethics and leadership? Why is it one of your passion topics?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I have really been around the world a lot in many countries and continents, and it's difficult to find a succinct summary of my life and what I can bring to the table, literally to the table today here. But maybe I will mention a few points so you get a little bit of texture. Mm-hmm. So I've been growing up in Vienna, and I went to school in places like the UK and also in university in the United States. So I have a master's degree from Harvard University in an obscure linguistic field called Sanskrit and Indology. And I then also did an MBA with INSEAD.
So you went to the dark side. You went from the liberal arts aspect more to the hard arts. If you call it that, yeah. You could the martial arts, you could say.
Yeah, you could say that. And there was the interesting thing. There was always a very strong quantitative aspect to this. Obviously, in business administration there is, but also in linguistics you will find that. And so, if another big chunk of my life was spent in the pharmaceutical industry with Pfizer, so you could say actually that my career is dominated by three aspects. One is technology. One is finance, and one is pharmaceutical industry, and or let's say healthcare, because then it becomes also more less focused on the medicines and more focused on healthcare in general. So that's pretty much what I did during most of my life, and now I have founded the Institute for Ethical Leadership, because in the end you always end up with the big questions. Obviously, in a different life stage, maybe you're interested in how can I make this project work, how can I make it more efficient, how can I optimize it. You're more interested in the how. Correct. And when you get in a couple of years, you're more interested in the why. Yes, and let me point out that the how remains very important. Yeah. And if you lose your eye on that aspect, you'll have a similar problem. So it's a hygiene factor, as we like to say. Yeah. You're also a serial entrepreneur, right? So you have exposure. You mentioned it kind of offhandedly. He's very humble with technology. Yes, so quite a lot of software projects, some of which are still ongoing and being reasonably successful. I have a few very innovative ideas in the blockchain realm, in the crypto space, where I won a few awards and so on. But it's one thing to have a great idea that the professors find and the panels find really cool, and yet another one to make it commercially viable. Yeah. Maybe I'm more of a idealist or philosopher. Yeah. Yeah. I think you're more than that, but we can. So what? So you kind of mentioned it might be the stage in your life. I think we all come if we've been working in the real world for a long time. I think one of the classical questions that eventually comes up is: have we made a difference? Do we matter? Is what I'm doing, has it made an impact? Was that your entry into the subject matter of ethics, or what kind of triggered the interest in ethics? Well, obviously, you are confronted with that problem throughout your career. Mm-hmm. And what I found very noticeable was when I went to business school, and one of the top business schools, and then they have this ethics day that they call it. An ethics day? There's an ethics day, and they do it right at the beginning of the curriculum. One whole day. Oh my God. One whole day on ethics, and then you get the whole spiel of the entire curriculum after that, without ever even mentioning it ever again. But it's a check. Yeah. But yeah, exactly. And so I'd like to maybe we can go a little bit more into depth about that. We will, yes. So that was one thing that then I kept remembering later. And but I think the key motivation is that throughout my career, I have noticed that bullies and really evil people and people who are just optimizing everything for themselves and who use really despicable means in achieving that, this is by far the majority of the people who are successful in business. This is my experience. Mm-hmm. And I have a whole list of acquaintances who have been very successful, who I all know personally that they are pretty much, and I will not use an expletive on your podcast, but you can imagine what I'm thinking. Yeah. And similarly, I know many people who have always stayed honest and who have been transparent and who have not engaged in shortcuts, who are where they are. They are certainly not up there. And it is very interesting. If we read the newspaper today, and we read all the time about people who have been admired for years, for decades, for the incredible success, and now they all end up in jail. Why is that? And I've come to the conclusion, you cannot really, in our capitalist system, the way it's set up right now, it is very difficult to be very successful without being dishonest. Without being unethical. Correct. Okay. That's a profound statement. I think you're pointed out something I think that's very important. And I think emotionally, our listeners will probably also say, the principle of being ethical, that's valuable. We all want to be ethical. But I think deep in our subconscious or in our unconscious, there's one of the reasons why ethical processes often fail in application is because of a certain fear. And one of the fears is losing competitive advantage. I think a lot of people see from not just from a military perspective, but also from an economic perspective. And I believe economics often mimics war. Okay. That there can be a short-term tactical benefit to being unethical.
In some industries, you might say that tactic is not a tactic, but a strategy, because it's more midterm and long term. Now, one of the things we discussed when we were kind of going through the outline of this potential podcast, or actually a real podcast, is you're actually doing some research for a book that you're kind of nailed down. And once again, I think the background premise is there's a lot of initiatives out there right now: corporate social responsibility, ESG and SDG. Let's kind of use the framework of your book to kind of whet the appetite of our viewers and listeners. Why do you think that ethics, or let's take a step back? What is your primary assessment of why there are attempts at doing more ethics, but it's failing? Is it failing from your perspective?
Yes, good question. I'm absolutely convinced that it's failing.
Okay.
Just in the light of what I just said about my experiences in the business world, if anything, it seems to be getting worse. I mean, the brazenness of business leaders to take advantage of really outrageous situations, illegal ones, or obviously endowed with a lot of conflicts of interest. All that is nowadays totally acceptable. People have somehow lost, not just that they don't get outraged anymore about it, they don't seem to see these situations anymore. I mean, if the president of the United States is becoming a car salesman for his best buddy in front of the White House, people think that there wasn't even a commentary pointing out that this is actually a quite outrageous conflict of interest. So I think it's not working. Mm-hmm. I think it's very clearly not working. But my analysis of why it's not working is because it's not taught in business schools the way it should be.
Okay.
And many structural reasons, or the second reason would be many structural reasons in our system, allow us to do certain things with impunity. And then if you can do those, then maybe you're stupid not to do them when other people do them, right? So, but obviously the underlying philosophical problem about that is that people think, they always think in what we have heard this word a lot lately, also in connection with the United States president. He's always described as being transactional. And what does that mean? Everybody, I really hate that word, because
it's a Middle Eastern word, actually. What the Middle Eastern word is bakshish, isn't it?
Well, no, I don't think that's what's meant. I think people who are transactional are seeking a short-term gain, on the sort of material level, without much regard for mid-term or long-term relationships or benefits. So, and this transactionalism is characterizing our economy, and that has advantages, because when you are very flexible in these kind of things, they can adapt very quickly to new situations dynamically. So there's this advantage, but the disadvantage is, of course, it really deteriorates the long-term orientation, and we can certainly prove that. Real value creation is impossible without taking a longer term view. Yeah. And by the way, this is exactly the same problem we have in politics, right? I mean, the shorter the cycles, the less accountable are politicians, and maybe that word responsibility, maybe that has something to do with business leaders as well.
Yeah. I was just talking with a close friend of mine recently. We were talking about the fairly dire political situation, or how it shifted, and I think it kind of ties into this whole concept of ethics. The focus in this podcast will not be so much the ethics of politics, although we might refer to it as examples. We want to focus on the business aspect of it. But I was kind of musing philosophically about where we are today. If we look at the last 10 years. If you look at some of the positive steps forward in the direction of ethics, theoretically, has been the rise of ESG and responsible investing. Publicly traded companies have stipulated for their board members that they have to do gain a certain amount of ESG points if they want to keep their job. There's been a whole bandwagon of mottos with corporate transparency. We've installed whistleblower protection, although I don't know a single whistleblower who wasn't punished in some form or fashion or turned up missing. And then the third element, which I think gave a lot of hope, is the new generations that are coming up, the millennial and Gen Zs. And it kind of reminds me, if I look at the new generation, I think there's a lot of hope there. What I love about them is they grew up in a fairly comfortable environment. A lot of them had what they needed. And it's made them open, or some people would say woke, and I'm not going to judge that statement. For me, woke is just another way of saying awake, and I think being awake is better than being asleep. But I think this generation reminds me a lot of the 60s, if we look at it from a historical perspective. Another generation that was very proud of his ideals and were willing to stand up for it. And if you go back in history and we look what happened to the 60s, they were basically subjugated through sex, drugs, and rock and roll, manipulation of media, and all sorts of things. So that original positive energy that wanted to go for cultural change kind of fell apart. And I think we're in the same danger nowadays. If you look, the last 10 years last 5 years, there's been a big focus on equality and diversity and inclusion and all that kind of things. And now we have a pendulum swing that's going completely in a different direction. I think a lot of corporations are throwing their hands up in glee, saying, we can push back on regulations. We need less regulation, less governance, less legal constraints. There's all sorts of examples of this. Let's go back to the actual premise of this podcast. Ethics in business. Why do we need it?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
But if you change the subject again to this, I would have quite a few things to say about the new generation, and maybe they are not so positive as you might. I mean, I love them too, because my children, obviously, of course, are of that generation. But obviously, we also know that they have a certain sense of entitlement.
Yes, yes. Every generation has its light and shadow sides. Yes.
Their literacy is greatly reduced, if I may say so, and there are certain other problems.
Short-term attention span.
Yeah,
the TikTok mentality.
Yeah. So but it is of course a valid point to try to instill these kind of values into the future generation. And there's a certain idealism, no doubt, that they represent. However, in my perception, they are also becoming increasingly cynical. And
yes,
and if you look at
which I think people are hoping for.
And if you look at the election results in the United States, there was a lot of young people who were causal to that, and that is because they are becoming misogynistic, and the culture wars have pretty much been won by the right,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's the outcome that we have. Why we need ethics in business? It's very simple, because we want our businesses to be profitable. And I believe that there's a sort of lose-all, not win-win and win-all, but a lose-all scenario when we abandon ethics in business. And of course, the question always remains, are there free riders who don't play by the rules and who can gain additional advantage for themselves? Yeah, maybe in the short-term setting, but as long as we take a little bit broader view, we will see that that is really not so profitable. And obviously, regulation and also awareness, self-regulation has a big role to play in that. So, and obviously, it's not enough to say others are unfair. Like we hear this a lot now, that everybody's very unfair to the United States. It's not, it needs some factual basis as well. So that is maybe another aspect that we should consider. We should base our assessment of reality on facts, if possible. And by the way, that is already the first step to becoming ethical, because when you think about it, business and project management, in the more narrow sense, but business in general and business leadership really consists of decisions, right? So decision making and the science of decision making, which is very well researched and very developed, is at the core of ethical behavior. Because typically, as a manager or as a project manager, but also as a business leader, you have certain choices you can make, right? And the question is, which way do you go? You make a decision, and then you will notice if you take an ethical analysis of those decisions, you will find out they're all bad. They're all bad decisions. There's always somebody who's losing. They're not satisfactory from an ethical point of view. We don't live in an ideal world where we can always make the perfect decision that makes everyone happy. So you will have to do a trade-off. And we all know that in economics, trade-offs is the name of the game. That's how we analyze most things. And of course, in business decisions as well. And now it turns out that the most ethical decisions are those where you do this weighing of options, where you spend a lot of time and a lot of care doing it. The worst decisions, which means the worst business decisions that actually destroy value, and also they're at the same time the worst decisions in an ethical sense, are those decisions that are not very much deliberated, that are maybe emotional, that are maybe done on the spur of the moment or without proper analysis. And many managers, many business leaders make decisions that way. It's just a fact. This really reminds me of the most impressive sentence I have heard in my business education at the business school, because the dean of INSEAD, it was the opening ceremony, and it was the very first sentence I heard. And that was the sentence that impressed me most. And he said, "There is nothing in the world that destroys more value than sloppy thinking."
Okay.
And that's why you business school students are here, because we're going to try to fix that to a certain extent and stop the sloppy thinking part, and make you, equip you with the tools to have this proper analysis. But if you think of it, if you think it further, you notice that proper decision making and the proper analysis that precedes it, of course, is the very basis of an ethical decision. And now coming to the things that you mentioned just before, the corporate social responsibility and the sustainable development goals and so on. And all these are trends that have already been in the corporate world for well over 10 years. And I've noticed that they are quite ineffective and unsatisfactory. And I can also pretty much, I think I can pinpoint why that is. All these concepts, by the way, the next thing, what we did at Pfizer recently was a sustainability report, which also contains all those ethical parts. So there's always going to be a new way of putting it, and maybe some new priorities, but unfortunately, on a systemic level, it's always the same. And what is it? It is this function of corporate ethics, corporate responsibility, social responsibility is always located at the public relations level. And the public relations level is really in an extended marketing function in many contexts. So is it close to the management? Yes, public relations is normally very close to management from an organizational perspective. So you normally have the leader, the general manager, and then the public relations will be directly allotted to this person, and with very, very direct influence. But does it have to do with the actual leadership? Absolutely not. It is just a function that really is public relations. It is a communication function to the outside, and it has nothing to do with actually putting these things and making them reality on the inside. Obviously, once you see the report and you see, okay, you're really doing a bad job, then of course the motivation for management will be to do this or the other thing to make it look better. But that's really the motivation, to make it look better. And That is actually now, if you allow me, I would like to make the next point.
Can I just jump in, because don't forget your thought.
Yes.
I want to concur with you. I actually had interviewed a couple different candidates that I knew that I wanted to bring to the podcast to talk about this subject, and I have a friend and a colleague of mine that was in my executive MBA with me from Carlson Business School. And she had a very important position. She was basically responsible for corporate social responsibility and ESG within her organization. She will remain unnamed, and her company will remain unnamed. And when I approached her and I talked to her about my idealistic understanding of how great I think SDGs are, and what this third level of evaluation, because you mentioned beforehand what we partly do. You mentioned, and I want to point this out. You said one of the reasons why we need to have ethics in business is because you believe there's a link to profitability. And the profitability might not be short-term, but it's definitely mid-term or long-term, because what it does, it creates the speed of trust. Speed means more efficiency in delivering. It's more a stakeholder engagement, which means more people are benefiting from it. You're building trust. Sustainability means also economic benefits. These are all aspects that tie into this profitability. But when I talked to her about corporate or social, she was also, I don't know if it was intentionally or unintentionally cynical. I guess she wanted to set my idealistic concept of it straight. She confirmed what you said, that there were two, and this is my experience also from the clients that I work with. The corporate social responsibility department is usually run, for some reason, and I don't have a problem with it, by young women. Young, intelligent, highly educated women that maybe don't have a lot of life experience in the corporate world. It's usually a staff position, so they don't have a lot of power. They're close to the board, and their two connections that they have very strongly to are the legal department and the public relations department. Now, I don't have principally a problem with that, but public relations for me is another way of saying the propaganda department. Okay. The question is, you're trying to bend the truth often. I'm not saying that that's the way it should be, but that's often its practice. How do we make something that doesn't look so good look better? That's the public relations kind of perspective, if you do it the wrong way. And the other thing is the legal aspect. What is our legal exposure for it? And what's lacking from my perspective is this whole, why aren't we tying in whatever you call it, the Department of Business Excellence or Kaizen or continuous improvement or change? Why shouldn't those be the people that are in this thing, that are actually really people that don't just know the why, but how do we take an idealistic idea and put feet on the ground? So that's
actually a very important part, and it really reminds me of that problem that we find in politics, where you sometimes have bad behavior, and then the answer is, the defense is, well, it's all legal. Okay.
Yeah, that's a gray area.
And compliance tells me it's fine, but that doesn't mean it's politically acceptable. That doesn't mean that you don't have
or socially acceptable. If we look at private equity, there's a lot of discussion now about how ethical is private equity.
Right.
If we look at the example of Red Lobster, if you're familiar with Red Lobster, is a restaurant chain in the United States that existed and there's a whole series of these stories, bought up by a private equity company. The company owned all of its properties, so it was fairly efficient in running its restaurants. They created shell companies that sold the property to their other sister companies, and then charged horrendous rent to the restaurant company, making it basically defunct and going into bankruptcy. And is this legal? Yeah, they can get away with it. Is it ethical? No. So I think there's a whole gray area that we should maybe talk about as well. But I interrupted you. Sorry.
There is exactly this difference between legal and ethical is, I think, pretty obvious. And I think you do very well in pointing out that it's not just a public relations function; it's also the compliance function, and that is, of course, entirely the wrong approach. And that is exactly why I think my ideas about ethical behavior in the corporate context is so important, because the key idea is that it's only possible to change something when you actually do it at the leadership level. And if you just make it look like it's at the leadership level, it's not enough. It has to be really on the leadership level. And once you go this step, you can go really, really deep, because you have to ask questions about the leaders. You have to ask about their characters. You have to ask about their values. You have to ask about their behavior, right? So, and we can come to that later. That's basically the conclusion of then how you fix it. But the main point is, and that's why we called it the Institute for Ethical Leadership. Without ethical leadership, there will be no ethics in an organization, no matter how much whitewashing you actually do with all kinds of means that are very popular nowadays. So, what is the problem? Why is it so difficult, and why haven't we made any progress in so many decades, right? Although clearly, I think many people are very honestly interested in changing this, and especially those young, ambitious women who are very well educated, who work in those functions. I mean, I really salute them. They're normally very idealistic. Some of them also very well paid, which is, by the way, also which is a good thing. But
I know a whole bunch of them that also got disillusioned, had burnout, and left.
But they are being used. They're being
absolutely.
really instrumentalized by this whole thing. And that's exactly the point. So I question, why do business leaders, why do they have this blind eye? And I think, I really believe that business education has an impact.
So you one of the roots that we would have to focus on are the business schools themselves?
Yeah, I think it's the business school themselves. And I would like to tell you a little anecdote to illustrate that. So I already talked about the ethics day. So in the ethics day, we had all these kind of workshops where we could really reflect on certain situations. What would you do, and what would be the right thing to do, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember one rule that we learned on that day, and that is it ethical? How can you tell? Well, if I can explain it to my children, it's ethical. And if I can read it on the front page of the newspaper on the next day, then it's ethical.
If somebody would bring it up on the first page of the newspaper, would you be embarrassed, or would you be proud of it? Yeah.
So, and I said, well, that sounds pretty reasonable. And then fast forward more than 10 years, or almost 10 years, I was working for a very cool company called eBay. And at that time, like in the early days of the millennium, they were growing super fast.
Yeah.
And I saw this internal broadcast with Meg Whitman, our great leader, which is a very intelligent, very successful, and extremely good manager and leader for eBay, who oversaw this incredible growth of the company. And she was in a very high regard, and we really liked her a lot. And then she was interviewed about business ethics, and her answer was, well, I always ask myself, can I read it in the newspaper? Can I explain it to my children? So I felt so good. I said, I obviously really learned
verbatim. Yeah.
I learned really what is the state of the art of business ethics. And I'm so proud of my leader, because she knows it too. Mm-hmm. And, obviously, we are all super ethical people, and so I was very happy then. Yeah. And now, a few decades later, I asked myself, basically, what you have to do is you have to just switch on your brain and think about what it actually means. So if I can explain it to my children, what am I looking for? I'm looking for the recognition of my children. If I can make my children into cynics, I can tell them anything, and they will say, yeah, well done, Dad.
They'll even embrace it.
Well done, Mom. You've made another 10 million. It's very good.
You took advantage. Yeah. It's like cutting in line,
And if it comes to the newspaper, do I have to tell you how many people are so unabashed and really brazenly do whatever they want, and they don't even care what's in the newspaper?
Well, in public relations, there's the old adage, any news is good news, right? Even if it's bad news.
Even that. So and both these things have to do with social shaming, okay? Either you are embarrassed in front of your children, or you are embarrassed in front of the public because of the newspaper article. And is social shaming, I'm asking the question now, is social shaming a good source for ethical content? I mean, how can I? Is that what is the definition of what is good and what is bad? Of course not. It can't be the source of ethical values.
It should be the primary motivation why you do good things. That you're afraid of being shamed.
It's a disaster that it's the primary. But that is what's taught in business schools, and that is what you see everywhere.
So it's okay as long as you get away with it. It's kind of the underlying message.
That is implied in it.
And if you get away with it, it kind of confirms to yourself, to your ego, and to your cohorts. Know that you're particularly smart, that you managed to find a loophole,
yes.
Right?
And that also shows you why the ethics function is always in a kind of external communication mode in the big corporations, the PR department, compliance department. So,
can I give you a real life? This is just a story that popped up. I won't name the name of the person in the company, but there's a very large company in Austria that's very well known that has a what's it called, their money in a trust. Okay, and I think de facto they pay, I think, a maximum of 6% taxes, which is fairly low if they pay taxes at all, right? And this person is famous for going in the news and saying rich people should pay more taxes. We don't, okay, but we would, right? And I'm like, are you listening to yourself? On one hand, you're acknowledging the fact that we should all be more ethical, right? And on the other hand, you're kind of thumbing your nose at us saying, yeah, but I mean, if you give me a loophole, and a lot of these loopholes are basically instigated by lobbies that look out for their own interest. I think that's a kind of a catch-22 when it comes to thinking about business ethics. So you were talking about where do we need to start? You said business schools would be one place to start. What would business schools have to do different?
Well, they would have to start telling a different story, right? And
And
there has been some developments. So, for example, one of the leading thinkers in business ethics is now Mr. Basserman, Professor Basserman of Harvard Business School, and he has a big thing about basically. So he's also a decision theorist. So that is good, right? He understands that ethics arises in decisions, in the context of decisions, which is a really good analysis. And actually, I was very much inspired by that. And I had a conversation with him as well about it when I set out to develop my model. But his main explanation of what's ethical and what is not is really not entirely useless, but maybe inadequate, which is basically a kind of modern utilitarianism. So you go back to John Stuart Mill's, where you can calculate, well, where this solution 10 people die, this solution 5 people die. Let's do the other solution where less people die. But obviously that is how shall I say? It's a good analysis because utilitarianism lends itself very well to the models that we use in business to judge what is the better solution. It's quantifiable, and we try to calculate the best outcome. So that is a higher degree of compatibility, and utilitarianism is certainly an ethical concept that is not the worst, right? But if you exaggerate it too much, you also arrive at a sort of cynical way to say, okay, well, this is the best solution, even if it's a terrible solution. Maybe it's one that you shouldn't do at all, right? Really, you mentioned it already before. You say maybe there are ethical tactics, but when you think a little bit more long term, maybe there's an ethical strategy in a business. Maybe there's an unethical strategy in the business itself. So my opinion is you really have to look at the business model, and that is really the first thing that you have to look at. And maybe there are some things that you just shouldn't do. So if you remember, we were just talking about utilitarianism, and that when you have a bad solution that is still the best solution, it might still be too bad to actually do it. So, for example, if you take the casino business, for gambling, in Austria, for example, this is a state-owned monopoly. Well, it is based on the premise that you can make people addicted to gambling and then take all their assets. And really, if you were to factor out this group completely, it wouldn't be a profitable business. So all those claims that it's an entertainment business and so on are totally bogus. It is insincere, and you have to ask yourself, how can you make this entertainment business such that it is not so harmful to certain vulnerable groups in society? And while this might be a stark example, it becomes more difficult if you think about tobacco or think about alcohol. Well, alcohol, you can't ban alcohol completely, right? So it has also positive aspects to consume alcohol. Maybe some doctors say it has no positive aspects, but we can agree on that there are positive aspects in culture and in our quality of life. But where exactly do you draw the line, right? And when it comes to energy industry, again, we have these incredible trade-offs. Everybody needs energy. Our whole civilization will cease to exist without energy. But on the other hand, how do you responsibly gain energy without destroying our planet? I mean, these are really deep questions that you have to grapple with when you are the leader of such an organization.
Are you familiar with the concept of wicked problems?
Absolutely. I mean, it starts with the commons.
Yeah. This is a term that I picked up recently, and I read a couple books on it, and I found it very interesting. And the very principle of wicked problems is the concept that there's certain systemic or societal problems out there that are so complex that there's not a one-time solution for it. They're difficult, if not impossible, to solve. Like, I don't know, might it be world hunger or homelessness or what it might be? Or, for example, some of the constraints that we have with the way our society is built up, for example, with petrochemical products and stuff like this. You mentioned beforehand the Austrian lottery system. I think the government solution to that is that it's something that's maybe not a net positive for the society if it goes to a certain extreme, but there's a tendency to bet one way or the other. At least it's in government hands. So at least the revenues that are generated go back to the government, so that on the other hand, they can use those profits to benefit society. And I think, for example, state-run lotteries are a good, not solution, but a semi-solution for these kind of wicked problems. I think if we're looking, for example, at petrochemical things, there's certain situations where petroleum companies will get the rights to certain property. They'll extract oil from there for a long, long time, make horrendous profits. And when the wells run dry, they'll leave them there, and the ground will be contaminated. But the companies have dissolved; they no longer exist. And when you say, "Well, who's responsible for cleaning up?" The people who benefited from it don't pay for it. Or another example: the pharmaceutical companies during COVID. A lot of the pharmaceutical companies in the United States and elsewhere got funding from taxpayers to do research to come up with a vaccine. Did we get a return of investment for that money that taxpayer? No. And these are ethical issues that create a certain cynicism. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I think you point out a good solution or a good approach. Let's say it's not a solution of how you can mitigate those wicked problems, and certainly to use the public funds, and use the government to redirect those streams of income is certainly a very viable solution, provided that you also think that government is a good thing. That is not really in the spirit of the time. Says, well, less government is better.
Propaganda is trying to convince us that government is inofficial and everything needs to be in private hands. I don't want to live in a world where private equity and private companies are responsible for our schools, for our social welfare.
That's right. So, to continue with that three-part framework, right? Mm-hmm. So I mean, we came to the first point really through the philosophical and what is the source of ethical behavior. Mm-hmm. But then I think in the second level, I call this the operational level. There's so many things we can do, and I think all the things that we already mentioned, they fit into this category. Mm-hmm. So it is what we do on the operational level. Do we separate our trash? Do we do recycling? Do we have fair hiring practices? Do we compensate our employees in a fair way? Do they have a good pension? What is our hire and fire policy? Is there any discrimination? Is there inclusion? And I don't mean to be a woke ideologist for DEI, but clearly to be fair to everyone involved, and also to build teams that are efficient and effective. Also involves these kind of things. But it could also be, what is the environmental impact of our company? Do we have good working conditions where people can, don't get sick while they work, right? Is it, do we care about education and continued training? And you name it. I mean, you can see there's many, many, many such factors. And I think that's really what many people today think about when they think about ethics in the workplace, and that's why I really want to include that, because that is, of course, this is the practical manifestation, and when of an ethical workplace, and many employees will say, yeah, this is a great company, this is a good company because they treat us well, and because we do this and that, and it makes me proud, and so on. I mean, you were talking about this pharmaceutical industry. I mean, arguably you could say that those research dollars went to a great public good, because arguably with the vaccines that were developed, potentially millions of people's lives were saved.
Or you could, from a financial perspective, say the cost of the medicine was then cheaper. But
yeah. So, but I mean, obviously, you have to look into the details to see what is if there has been some ethical deviation. And then, as mentioned already, so obviously, this is a whole bunch of measures that you should have your eye on. Mm-hmm. And then to the third level is, of course, the leadership level itself. And I think that's the most critical one, because if there's no ethical behavior, or it's more than a behavior, it's really a kind of culture. It's something that is, you can't pinpoint on one specific decision or so, but it's really about, it's about habits. It's about, so basically, I've structured it in 3 different parts. One is basically the questions of character and values. And this is a difficult question, because how can you say, okay, this manager has a good character, bad character, right? But why? Sometimes I ask myself, why is this question not asked? Why do we just say, okay, he's a very smart and he's very successful, and that's really all that is required of somebody. Very rarely will you ask, is he a good person? Does he have attitudes that benefit other people, that benefit society, and so on, right? So, or does he, I don't know, is he of particular faith maybe that inspires ethical behavior? I mean, I don't say that certain such traits are a prerequisite for certain jobs. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it should be part of the conversation. And when I talk about a person's character, a leader's character, I mean, what are his values, his or her values? Mm-hmm. And when the values are, well, I want to make as much money as humanly possible, then that should be on the table, and say, okay, well, you have a leader who is really trying to maximize that, right? Or maybe he's has an allegiance to a political party and says, I want to do everything to support that that direction in which the country or the economy is going. So so in my opinion, this is a very important question, and it can be assessed with certain techniques, like, for example, with surveys and with interview questions. And the second aspect is, I call this the habits, and that is really that describes how a leader cultivates himself, right? So this is maybe an old Confucian idea of self-cultivation. But that is like for ancient Chinese thinking, Confucian thinking, this is a prerequisite for any leader, that he keeps improving himself. And the question is, what is he really doing? Is he reading books? Is he meditating? Is he or she, obviously I always mean men and women equally, does the leader spend time just to think about things, right? For analysis. What's the process for making decisions? I think this is a very key one. how broad, a spectrum of advisors and helpers does he or she cultivate, and so on. There are many, many other things about these habits, which also go into behavior. And so, for example, if you have a leader who's shouting around all the time, who falls into tantrums, and who's treating his underlings in a despicable way, then obviously that's also part of the entire personality that you need to take into account, right? So that's the second level. And the third level is, I think, really on the level of skills, right? So obviously we know that a leader needs the executive function parts. He needs to be good at analysis, good at decision making, and so on, right? But I mean, really, what should be looked at here is how you can put ethical ideas into action. Right?
So does you mentioned there are two different levels. We need to do different. You mentioned the first three levels. The first level being, what was the first level before operational again?
It was like your business model.
Your business. So the business model is one aspect that we need to take into consideration if you're trying to create a framework for ethical leadership. Second would be the operational effectiveness and efficiency. And third would be the leadership, and you broke that down into character, values, habits, and skills. That's all makes sense, and I think most people would nod their head and say, yeah, I would agree with that. But you also mentioned, I think, a little bit earlier on that de facto, if we look at our leaders that we have, I think there's a disproportionate number of psychologists. There's all sorts of articles that talk about how only 7% of the world's population fall into the category of sociopath or psychopaths, but they're overrepresented in criminal behavior, and they're also overrepresented in the C-suite. I don't know how much of that is polemic. I think there's some legitimacy. I don't know if the numbers are correct, but I think it's also partly our society or our corporations' fault for the leaders we pick. What about these negative examples of leaders that make them so compelling to pick? And what would we have to do to pick better leaders? Do you have a concept for that?
This is a complicated question. I've mentioned it before in the beginning, pointing out that my motivation to turn towards the topic of ethics is that basically in my life I've met a lot of these kind of bullies who come out the winners, right? Yeah. And ultimately, I think it is a systemic problem, right? So how do these bullies become these C-suite leaders? Although they have maybe a psychological condition. And the reason is because they get elected by their boards, right? And then you have to ask who's sitting on those boards, and well, it's the people who own these companies, and the owners really they're motivated by greed, and they want to maximize their own income without having to do anything with the dirty work involved. So they hire those people who do the dirty work for them, and those psychopaths, they will willingly do this work, and all that in a cultural context where they are admired business leaders with successful companies, and from the outside it's all sugar coated, but on the inside, it is really all about taking advantage. And I think that is there is a solution to that. I mean, this is a freewheeling capitalism, and I'm a total capitalist. I think this is the only way that resources are allocated efficiently. But clearly, if you exaggerate it, it will have negative externalities.
Well, I think
these negative externalities are typically exactly the ethical problems we are talking about. It's the destruction of the environment. It is the impoverishment of all parts of the society. It is unfair business practices and the suffering of the people who then work for those businesses. It is the disenfranchisement of consumers. You name it. I mean, there's so many problems associated with that, but it starts with the greed of the business owners.
Well, you mentioned this before when we talked about social shaming. I think the problem that we have is that anything that's uncontrolled. I'm also a capitalist at heart, but I'm a fan of ethical capitalism, and I believe that that's not a misnomer. I believe that's a possibility. I think that an unchecked and uncontrolled capitalism makes greed its number one principle, and I think that's also at the heart of the competitive market. And I think far too many companies see their transactional relationship with society as a form of war. So I think that's definitely a problem. I believe that one of the problems that kind of promotes this kind of behavior is an insufficient amount of consequence and accountability at a high level if you make a mistake. I mean, if presidents can pardon themselves and everybody who's involved, that doesn't set the right example. If you're a poor person and go into a gas station and you steal a Mars bar and you get a life sentence for it, but a Bernie Madoff who's ripped off millions is secretly, subconsciously celebrated as hey, he's a real stud because he managed to take advantage of the system. I think we've got a serious issue here. I also think that there is a political responsibility that is missing. I think the purpose, and I've had two guests on where we talked about the lack of leadership in politics. I believe that the true purpose of government is not to overregulate, but in that sense, create a framework that has accountability. That they should be working. A lot of people say government is here to protect the minorities from the majority. I think quite the contrary. I think that the government is here to protect the 99% of the population from the 0.01% who would take advantage if you let them. All right. And you've kind of mentioned it before, and I think part of the problem we have with ethics is that a lot of these bad players are buying the legal system, they're buying the politics. But we're kind of going off on a tangent here.
But maybe you have your finger on a very important aspect here, because the politicians, and this is something that you can really compare to the business leaders as well. But the politicians really often try to cater to certain constituents, and they will, for example, say, well, my constituents who normally vote for me, they are racist, so I'll be a little bit racist too, so I can still, they'll still like me and they'll still vote for me. And what they don't do is to tell their constituents, look, it's not good to be racist. It's a very bad development that you, my beloved constituents, are now becoming racist. Please listen to me. We shouldn't be racist. There's other solutions. There's other attitudes that we can have to solve our problems, our real problems, maybe with immigration, what have you, right? So that is a dynamic you find very often. Like, am I being influenced by what is always framed as an inevitable necessity? Because you can say, okay, I cannot become a racist, I won't get elected, and then I'm out. There's no influence now. It's better I stay a little bit racist, and then I can maybe do policies that I find still important. I think that the center-right parties in many European countries operate exactly like that. And it is, of course, a very, very wrong approach, because we know it's a slippery slope towards deterioration of values. And the answer is, of course, exactly like what's in the headline, the leadership. You don't have leadership, that means that you also have leadership of ideas. Obviously, maybe we can have a short-term success in an election, but the long-term, I think it's very well analyzed. The long-term you will lose. So that is really what we need. We need leaders who actually have ideas and who have who want to be chosen because of their ideas and not because of their willingness to be subservient to the. I think you're
kind of tying into two things that you've triggered in my thought, and one, I'm always a big fan of being constructively critical. Okay, I think when you're looking at a system and you're looking at the status quo and you see points of contention, I think it's important to focus on individual players and certain constellations. But I think we as a system, we are part of the system, we contribute to it. And the question is, what can an individual or those who are victims of the system do. And it brings me back to the question, why do we pick the types of leaders that are often unethical or sociopaths or psychopaths? I think if we're honest with ourselves, it's because a lot of these people have also good qualities. I have to be very careful what I'm saying here. I'm not trying to be apologetic for their negative behavior, but I think a lot of these, if you think of Elon Musk, if you think of Steve Jobs, and if you think of a number, Tim Cook, or any number of, or even Henry Ford, who a lot of these people were abhorrent people in their private lives, but very successful business people. Now, I'm not saying that they were good business people because they were racist or because they were misogynistic or because they had an inhumane view of the world, but they had other qualities which did endear them to the masses. And I think, one, they were charismatic. Okay, and I think charisma is not a good or bad thing in the sense, it's how you use it. And I find a lot. I think one of the big problems they have, and I think Charles Bukowski says this, the stupid people are loud and proud. I'm kind of re-quoting his quote. Stupid people are loud and proud and do whatever they want, unabashed, and they live life happy and often successful. And people who are highly intelligent are often overly self-reflective and self-critical and don't speak up. And I think what we all look for when we select, if we were out in the wild and we were to pick a leader, there are certain qualities of leadership that we're looking for that are missing in some of our more reflective and humble leaders, and are very prevalent in some of these sociopaths and psychopaths. And one of these qualities that I always have noticed is and it kind of ties in with what part of your model in your research is, the ability to make succinct, distinct, and quick decisions in an environment, and this is increasingly so, where volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity is going up. What the masses want is a semblance of stability and security and certainty. Okay? They don't want somebody who's wishy-washy and all over the place. They want somebody, and you were talking about trade-off factors, has the ability to look at the fact, and if we go back also to the concept of wicked problems, what is the solution? According to the literature I've read on wicked problems, you can't solve the whole thing, but what you do is you pick out a certain aspect. Instead of trying to solve the Goliath of the problem, what you do is you pick out aspects of it that are manageable, and you manage those. Consequential. And this means making distinct decisions, even if there's an interim pain period to get to the positive aspect. So thinking midterm, long term also means sometimes short term. There'll be pain points. So making decisions that are difficult to make, being able to be quick on knowing if I'm looking at A, B, C, which is the better solution, kind of using their gut instinct. And another thing which I kind of ties in with what you were saying beforehand, what I find lacking a lot of it is the ability to have vision. Vision for me means the ability in volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity to look into your mental crystal ball and say, nobody knows where it's going. Nobody knows what the future is, but I'm going to tell you where the future is. This is where we're going. And there's thousands of examples from the past. If you go back to Julius Caesar, or you go to Steve Jobs, who, when everybody was divesting, this is one of my favorite examples, when everybody was divesting from laptops, Apple said, no, laptop, people are still willing to pay $2,000 plus for a laptop. HP was saying, are you crazy? It's not profitable. You can't sell a laptop if it costs more than $600. So this is the ability to have vision. And I think the big problem the society has when they're looking at people who have vision is discerning who's nuts, who's literally sociopathically, psychopathically nuts, and doesn't have any concept of reality, and who is a genius and sees something that we don't see and gives us a path to the future that we are looking for. I think that's a challenge. I think one of the reasons why we have so many psychopaths and sociopaths as leaders is because they're outspoken, they're quick to make the decisions, they don't feel guilty when they do make a decision, and they have vision, even if the vision is off in La La Land. Okay,
but maybe there's a fallacy here.
Okay,
because we like to admire people who boldly went when nobody went before.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the fallacy is because we only see those successful people who maybe have had outlier visions and plans, and we do not see the thousands or maybe tens of thousands who had the same and who failed, right?
Yeah.
And it is also, in the end, it is also a question of luck and statistics of what fails and what succeeds. So clearly the traits that we recognize in those successful leaders some of them seem to be prerequisites that are necessary, and a certain willingness to follow through, maybe even a certain ruthlessness, one that might,
or resilience.
Yeah,
the ability to get back up, because quite honestly, we all make mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, Steve Jobs, when he went to Next, I mean, he was pretty much down and out, at that point, and look how roaringly he came back. Yeah? So
are you saying that one of the qualities that maybe our listeners who want to be leaders is charisma, vision? But what you're saying, and I think your point is spot on, is to say, listen, acknowledge the fact that as a leader you're going to make mistakes, but have the strength of character and the resilience to come back fighting.
I think what is important is, and that is also goes into politics, if you have a vision, you should be able to explain this vision, and
you have to be a storyteller
and to convince people of it. And I've found out that those politicians and also those business leaders who are particularly convincing and who are successful, they are not necessarily only those that are liked by others. So many people who want to be successful, they want to make themselves liked and admired and so on. But I think it's quite the opposite. The successful ones are the ones that make you believe that they like you.
Yeah.
And if you listen to Trump, he always says, "I love you" all the time, right? Does he mean it? Nobody can really assume he does. Yeah. And yet, because people like to hear that, they will follow him. So that explains a lot of the charisma in many cases. People want attention and they want affection, and that normally works.
They want consequential behavior. They don't really care about the consequential behavior. That's really the problem. And it is, I think, where we have to, so how this is triggered and how these decisions or these elections are made seems to be rather clear. But what is important is what happens afterwards. And I think one antidote to psychotic behavior and rampant egotistical taking advantage is a set of rules, basically. And the rules can only make any sense when there's a certain degree of transparency. But the transparency is a regulatory thing on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, it's a cultural question in the companies. And what would be nice is to have a yardstick where you can say, well, this is a company that has enough transparency so we can actually watch how ethical their decisions are and how they are moving along on this dimension, and others that are just basically opaque, right? I mean, it's already, to a certain extent, that is already the case, because we have certain ideas about some companies to be more transparent and more likable and more responsible than others. But in the end, it comes down to culture. I mean, things for which in Germany a politician will resign, in Austria nobody will even think about it, right? And the famous quote of killing somebody on Fifth Avenue, that doesn't matter. Shooting them in the face, yeah.
It has come to pass. On January 6th, 5 people died, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right?
Let me kind of shift gears, because I'm having a great time with this conversation, but I think we also want to kind of look for our viewers and listeners to kind of give them a guideline. I think I hope we've kept you interested with our philosophical and also kind of practical topics here. But let's shift gears and maybe kind of put it into context. So if because we can talk about society, but society is always abstract in the sense that it's external. We're part of it, but it's kind of externalized, and we can point the finger. And I always say, when you point the finger, there's always 3 fingers pointing back. I think from a constructive kind of PM Cowboy mentality, if we can't fix the world, if the wicked problem is too big for us to solve, let's start off with the problems that we can solve. So I'm assuming there's a number of leaders out there listening to us. I'm assuming there's a lot of people out there who want to be leaders and or maybe disenfranchised or cynical about their prospect. What can we tell these people if they're focusing on themselves? Okay, so the first message is ethical leadership makes sense. There's a value proposition, and maybe the value proposition is more midterm or long term.
Not necessarily.
You also see a short-term benefit?
Absolutely. I see there is I think if there's one thing that you can improve today to make yourself more ethical and to also move the entire society towards a more ethical direction, is just take more time, take more care, take more attention to your decisions. It is that simple. And that is actually something that you should educate yourself about, because there are many strategies that you can employ to make better decisions. For example, I could just give an example. There's a whole literature about it. But one that I like particularly well is, and that actually turned up in our conversation already several times, is that when you have certain options, very often the fallacy is that you have only two ways to go, and then so you take the better one without really exploring if there's an even better one.
A third alternative.
Yeah, or even the fifth, or even the seventh, right? So a very, very good strategy is always to generate more options, right? If you look at the getting to yes, the Harvard method, it's always create options, right? So that is something that I think any good leader, any ethical leader, and I say any good leader, because it's really about the quality of the decisions. The quality of the decisions will go up if you employ those techniques, of which generating more options is one. And when you make better decisions, these decisions will by default be also more ethical.
Can I jump in? Because I love, and I want to continue with the decision making, because that's a kind of a pragmatic checklist that we want to give our listeners. How, if I want to become a more ethical leader in a pragmatic sort of sense, so being able to make better decisions is a hallmark of ethical. But I want to, because
and by the way, it's what's very important from the leadership perspective. You have to make sure that this culture of decision making is really permeated through the entire organization.
Now you're going in the direction that I thought you insinuated, but I didn't want to miss. And I think that the precursor to this, I think the preliminary part where you can live ethics, so to not make it abstract, to make it a day-to-day practice is, and I want to kind of go back to this DEI thing. I know that it's become an ad hominem, but quite honestly, I've seen a lot of content on this. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is kind of our sub-pillars of ethical behavior. The principle of we're playing a game together, okay? We're a system, and if we want to work together where there's a win-win-win-win-win-win situation, this needs to be part of our DEA, that there's rules that apply to everybody. Everybody has the same consequences. Everybody has the same privileges. I think this is a key element to build trust, because you can make all sorts of decisions, but there's a huge connection between building trust, getting engagement to people that they'll even listen to you. Because I don't know how often I've tried to make decisions in certain environments where people are not even willing to listen to me because I've forgotten that, or I haven't spent enough time building a relation. And you mentioned how important it is that a leader includes others. I don't like the present president, but I don't think he makes a lot of his own decisions. I think he's famous for I don't want to exaggerate the negative parts of it, but the positive part of making decisions, and I think this is one of the key things that leaders have to understand. Leaders are often not in the position to know the answer. I think the skill set of a leader is the ability to aggregate options by engaging people at different levels, being able to talk to the different, facets of the issue, right? Maybe talk to IT department, maybe talk to us with finance department. What are your pain points? Talk to sales, talk to the client, okay? And to aggregate this information and use kind of also a structured groupthink process to decide what is the problem and what are the potential solutions, which brings us back to that pragmatic concept of, because where are you going to get a lot of ingenious ideas? I'm a big fan of watching Dr. House, although I find he's a terrible personality, but I still like watching the show. he has this concept where he has a bunch of doctors that he treats like crap, which I'm not recommending you do as a leader. I don't think it's a way to be a good leader. But what he does is he gets different ideas, and they, these different ideas, they feed off each other, and they give you the possibility of making mistakes and learning from mistakes. I think if I were to give anybody advice on leadership when it comes to making better decisions, is learn to listen more. Learn to do management by walking around and asking people. Getting all sides of the perspective. And also very, very important, letting people believe that the decision is not yours, but theirs. Would you agree that that's part of good decision making?
Absolutely. That's, I think, in line with generating options is obviously to listen to other people and to find perspectives that maybe you couldn't have thought of yourself. The taking care about good decisions is also a question of awareness, right? So being aware of other factors that are not so single, not your single-minded purpose only, but that are a bit broader. So this kind of broadening of your horizon is certainly a key aspect of it. Now, obviously, there are some objections to this theory, because you can say, okay, I have a whole array of opinions now and of options. So how can I make sure I don't choose the most profitable option rather than the ethical option? Or actually, I make this trade-off as well. So this is really where the consciousness comes in and where the values come in.
And the question is, who's profiting? Because there's different ways to profit.
Right. So
is it individual profit? It's kind of this trade-off factor. Am I sacrificing the benefit of society, my team, or is it just the shareholder? I mean, I think one of the biggest transgressions of Harvard Business School in the last 30, 40 years is the concept of shareholder value.
Yeah. So shareholder value was certainly a very ingenious way to describe of how sort of everything a company does in the end trickles down to that one number, the dividends, right, and the market value of a company. And of course, there's a lot of power in that, but we know today that the premise of that idea is the market efficiency hypothesis, which is a very good hypothesis, but it's certainly proven wrong to at least to 100%. So here we know there are externalities that are not factored in here, and it comes down to a question of fairness, right? So if stockholders get all the profit, it just doesn't represent any fairness in our society anymore. So it is, in a way, it is nice to actually think this through until its entire absurd extreme. When you really have the 1% who own everything, well, they will have a pretty sad life as well, right? Because if they live in a society where everybody is begging them for money on the streets, right?
So I don't want to say that shareholders aren't have some value, but from my perspective, I remember the first time I read it coming out of Harvard Business School when I was in business school. I questioned, what's the benefit of basically getting a loan? You might even say they're loan sharks, right? You're getting a loan, and now you have a one-time benefit, whatever that they pay, the nominal value of that share that they bought, and now you're exposed to them for the rest of eternity. And in financial calculation, from a quantitative perspective, the term that's used for value evaluation is always 1 year, right? Which is how many good strategies get positive feedback within a year. So I think one of the biggest challenges we had with shareholder value is that a lot of this TikTok mentality of, I don't care, I don't understand what you do, I don't care what your strategy is, how are you making a buck for me?
And there's another aspect that we had already encountered in our conversation, but it's a very interesting link somehow. A good manager, a good leader for a company that is publicly traded, he's not actually managing the company, he's managing the expectations.
Yes.
That is really best for the stock prices to manage the expectations.
It's public relations again,
And exactly, you are back to this communicative factor, back to this sort of social construct about value, which doesn't necessarily correspond to the actual value on the ground.
And I think what it's done is slightly perverted our concept of what leadership is. Leadership is, and I sometimes lack this in the C-suite, the ability to have a relationship to the people beyond the shareholders. And those are your stakeholders. Those are your employees. That's your middle management. Those are your clients. Those are your partners. Those are your vendors, right?
The community.
The community that you live in. So if we want to create a win-win-win situation where we have sustainability, where the company will be around for a long time, you can't just focus on the quantitative or shareholder perspective of it, right? So if we were going to kind of go back to this premise, what can we tell individual people who are listening to this? What can they do to become a better leader? I think we might be able to summarize is learn to become a little bit more charismatic, learn to care about the people that work for you.
Just think about your values. So that is something you can enhance with in many ways. Maybe you have a trusted guru or teacher, or maybe you can you want to read some books, to sort of enhance that. Certainly hone your skills. I think that's a very important part. Be a better manager, a better decision maker.
Decision making is the key, right? The ability when everybody else is confused, you might be confused as well, but have the process skill set to sit down and say, okay, let's nail down the individual elements and look at the trade-off factors. Because that's what I find as a consultant. I often find with my clients, I think the biggest service that I often provide them with is in the confusion of all the different options, I say, hey, let's limit it, let's structure it a little bit.
And that brings me to the second point, the third, which is the habits, right? So I have this wonderful example of my economics professor at INSEAD. His name is Randall Heap. He was so admired by the students because he was actually the world champion of Texas Hold'em. And he had just won the championship, and then he was in our classroom, and everybody could look it up on the internet of how much he had just earned. So it made them very, very differential to him. Yeah. Because normally those alpha types in the business school classes, when they encounter those professors, they have a little bit of a disdain for them because why are they professors if they're so smart? Why aren't they super rich in business? Yeah. But this guy was very good because his economics point of focus was game theory, right? Mm-hmm. So game theory, he applied it to the poker table. It was really a brilliant thing. And he basically he had a consulting company in California where he was guiding big energy companies through decision trees, which is exactly how
everybody knows what they look like. Nobody knows how to calculate them.
Right. And then he said, okay, let's put a probability here, and then this happens, and then this competitor does this, and then this external factor, and so on. And he was constructing this whole game theoretical grid of decisions and probabilities of outcomes and so on. And the way he described it, these were huge matrices that really you needed a whole huge conference room table to just sort of write it down. And what was the outcome? Was it the Nash equilibrium that was then the solution for that company? Of course not. Yeah. But it was the process of thinking it all through. And that is the habit I want to imbue on future managers and future leaders. To have this kind of habit, to just take the time to think things through, to analyze it, to get outside opinions, to listen to them, and also to make this entire process as transparent as you possibly can. And then from that, I think, grows a sense of accountability. Because maybe that's a word, we have talked a bit about responsibility, but we haven't really talked about the accountability part. And many of the leaders are not accountable, and that is the root of their corruption. Yeah. But I think the outcomes wouldn't be that terrible if they had these kind of habits and these kind of values and these kind of skills.
I think it's great that you bring up the topic of accountability again, but let's talk about the gaming theory, because I think that's a great analogy for what a skill set that you potential and real leaders out there can have. Anybody who's ever played Texas Hold'em realizes that it's a game of chance, but it's not just a game of chance. There's skill involved in it as well. Can you eliminate chance completely in your thought process? No. But by using certain methodologies, you can play with probabilities, okay, and make better decisions. And ultimately, people who win in poker, I don't know what the percentage of it is luck, but there's a huge percentage of skill involved as well, and the ability to crunch numbers and look at these different problems. And I think the most important thing is...
May I interject here?
Yeah.
One hand of poker is a game of luck.
Yeah.
But a repeated game
That's where I was going.
is entirely a game of skill. And there we are again at the short-term and long-term orientation that we had before. And, I like this topic a lot because, you see, in Austria, there was an entrepreneur who wanted to do a poker room. He saw them in the United States, so he wanted to make one here as well. So he built a huge poker room, and then he said, "Oh, I need skilled people to deal the cards, right?" So he went to the government to get some subsidies to have the training, and he had 40 people trained as card dealers. Just imagine the company that provided the training. They must have this great. What a great business to.
Yeah.
Okay. So it cost several thousand euros to have all these people trained, and then he wanted to open his shop, and he couldn't because the government said, "No, we have a monopoly on gambling." Yeah. And then he basically said, "But it's not gambling. It's a game of skill. It's not gambling." Okay. So he went to court, and the government prevailed, but I think he had very good arguments of why it is not a game of chance. And similarly, there was a similar case on the opposite side in New York, because in Washington Square Park, there were these chess players, and these were chess players who played for money, very streetwise players, right? So
speed poker,
they got sued. Basically, there was a complaint to get them out of the park because of.
I'm sure the IRS went there too and said, "You guys owe me." But
but basically it was for the children, and they get into this gambling, and so basically the chess players went to the witness stand in court and said, "No, chess is not a game of luck. Okay, in every situation you can have a better." You can have a better move, and or you can find the best move. But of course, if you play a fast game on the street, there's a lot of luck involved because you cannot know everything all the time. So again, the other side prevailed. Although actually, chess is not a game of luck.
But what you kind of alluded to before, and I don't want to let that slip because I want to nail it down because I think that's a valuable thing. What you said is one hand of poker is luck. But if you play the full game with a perspective and with a system, okay, it then becomes a game of skill. And I think if there's one thing that we can learn from people who might be psychopathic or sociopathic in their behavior, is they bounce back quickly. They understand that, it's not how many times you fall that determines whether you're a winner or not. It's how many times you get up and still have belief and faith in yourself. And I think this ties into the concept of accountability. I think a lot of great potential leaders out there, be it in politics or economics or mid-managers who've wanted to move up, they might fail, or they might have their ego bruised, or they might be, somebody might take advantage of them, or they might be, they might jump over them in the promotion cycle, or often become cynical, maybe not cynical, but also disillusioned and say, and turn away from the game. And ultimately, if we want better leaders in society, the good people have to become more resilient. They have to be able to understand that losing a hand of poker is just part of the game. Failing is part of the game. Getting bruised.
Well, the key strategy at a repeated game of Texas Hold'em is that whenever you lose a little bit less, and when you win a little bit more. Yeah. And that is really the little delta that makes all the difference. Yeah. And maybe if you apply that to your like medium-term repeated decision making in your career, then maybe that is exactly the same, right? Maybe you can lose some, but make sure you don't lose too much when you lose your hand, which can always happen.
Let's talk about accountability. It was a topic that you said that we should take a look at again. I'm a big fan. I think one of the biggest problems we have with ethical leadership is that I don't think shaming is enough. I think there need to be real consequences. Although I think we need to find, and this is what makes this a wicked problem, we don't want to punish innovation or honest innovation, attempted innovation. I don't think we need to create. I think if you look at, for example, Europe versus the United States going into bankruptcy, it's punitive in Austria, for example. Going into konkurs or bankruptcy can ruin you for life. Okay, in the States, it's often treated as a badge of honor. I think it's exaggerated.
Maybe I mean there are ways to get out of bankruptcy in Austria just as well and then have a fresh start.
Yeah.
But where you're right is in the cultural sense.
Yeah.
When somebody is what we call a pleitier, somebody who went bankrupt, he's always a loser.
He's a loser.
And
he's
nobody
stamped on his forehead.
And nobody will ever trust him anymore. But that's actually not entirely true because there are also examples to the opposite.
It's changing. I think
the examples to the opposite. So, for example, the D-Tech entrepreneur who went bankrupt, he started a new company and there's 100 employees now.
But this ties back to a concrete quality that we can learn from. Accept the fact you're going to make mistakes. Accept the fact that you're going to make wrong decisions. Accept the fact that some of the things you do are not going to lead to success. But don't lose faith in who you are.
I have to protest. So
okay, please.
There is this myth, there's this adage to say that we have to have the capability to fail, right? Yeah. And that maybe in many European countries that this is underdeveloped and it's much better developed in the United States and other more mercantilistic societies. And that's all true, and I'm all for it, and I have my own share.
I think I know where you're going. I want to hear this. I would agree with you. Keep going.
I have my own share of failed companies, okay? But, and this resilience is very important, but I cannot hear it anymore. You know? There is actually a conference in California, it's called like it's about failure, and then the keynote speaker said, "I failed 12 times." Big applause, right? So to sort of, you can also exaggerate that and celebrate this failure. And the key is, let's again look at the poker game. When you lose,
don't lose because you're stupid.
Don't lose everything.
Don't lose because you're stupid.
Yes, always measure. There's not a black and white thing like you're losing or you're winning. It's the life is more complex and more nuanced, and I think what we need to develop is a sense for this nuance. And also that is in a way maybe also a little bit the first idea of how we can approach a solution to accountability. Because maybe we should evaluate not just the outcome, but also the process. Right? And then factor that in as well.
Absolutely.
Like you were lucky, you lost millions, but you did everything. But you did everything right, okay? Because it's still the lesser evil. If you had done that, we maybe would have won huge, but maybe we would have really lost a lot. So as for our risk profile, that was the right decision. We lost, okay, let's move on, right? Let's do the next thing. Now we still have capital left because we haven't lost everything. We have only lost a part. So this kind of culture just has to take root. And it has to take root not only in the C-suite, it has to take root in the board.
What you're talking about is you're not advocating for reckless abandon, I think is the term that we talk for. It's not just say, hey, I can absolve myself in advance for anything stupid I do. I think one of my favorite quotes from Bismarck, he once said, a smart person learns from the mistakes, a genius learns from others' mistakes. I think that's what you're referring to, right?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So what needs to be done to create a fair amount of accountability, and what do you understand under accountability for leaders, for ethical leaders?
Well, I think the accountability should go up the chain. I think that's the solution. The boards should become accountable too. And the boards are totally non-accountable because they're just representing the owners. And the worst thing that can happen to them is that their company goes belly up and goes to zero, right? But what about their accountability for the rest of society, right? And that is really totally lacking. So in my opinion, this board of directors, this is really the point where and there's a lot of regulations in countries like Austria about board of directors, but there's no regulations about their societal responsibility and their ethical responsibility. So
would you see that to be the responsibility of politics to make that, to stipulate that?
Yeah, I mean, politics has already started with this, but only with the sort of very salient topics. For example, the amount of women who are in a board of directors, it's now stipulated for a minimum. Things like that, and obviously they never want to exaggerate this kind of regulation on that level, because then it becomes maybe unattractive as a place to do business. But I think the main reason for that would be that there's a lot of competition internationally, that where you can have alternatives where you don't have to care about those things. Again, this kind of measure, let's take the diversity measure for the board members. Mm-hmm. It is an advantage for the company, because obviously the more diversity you have, the more competent decision that body can make, because they can generate more options before they take a decision. So this is all ties in always into the same. You can see how these patterns repeat themselves on the various levels. And then I think this is the main problem. The main problem is that accountability stops at the chief executive, and it should really go beyond.
Yeah, I think there's this barrier, this wall barrier. The lower downs are held accountable in the sense of being fired, maybe not legally. I often find that project management is also kind of a scapegoat system.
Absolutely.
Where executives pick young, ambitious project managers that do their bidding. If they succeed, it's the benefit. It's to the glory of the C-suite. If they fail, then they have a volunteer, armer Schlucker, as we say in German, right? Oder Prügelknabe. But whipping boy, that's definitely an issue. So you're doing some research which will lead to an actual output, a book that you're working on.
Yes, that, and also there's actually another part to this puzzle, because if you go into a company, and say, okay, so you want to talk about ethics. So what now?
Yeah,
where do we start? Yeah. Right. So one thing that I also we try to develop is an assessment tool. So it's like a survey, and then you answer a few questions.
Who fills out the survey?
Well, that's the important part. So the top management should fill it out, and then typically also parts of the middle management. Mm-hmm. And there are questions like, what would you do in this situation? And there's some ethical trade-offs, maybe some multiple choice, mm-hmm. which goes from, you blow a whistle and you just go along and whatever the situation is. And then what we found in some companies where we did that is that there's a great delta between these two layers of management. So on the project manager level, there's one view of the ethical behavior of the company, mm-hmm. and then on the top level, it's completely different. And it's interesting. There are basically two opposite trends. One is that you have these very conscientious project managers who care about all those details very much, and their success their projects are successful because they are aware of all the other. They have aspects that could influence their project, and so they are aware of it, and they have many options, and they always keep all the balls in the air and so on. So these kind of good project managers, they normally think, well, we have a great company and we really care, and we do the right thing and so on, right? So and then the management, the top management, is always systematically overestimating the quality of their own ethical. So that is a given. Okay, there's always an outlier. And then what is sometimes though still possible is that or what is actually quite common is that the lower level management will have become already very cynical.
Or the employees.
Exactly, and they will say, "Well, it's a freaking disaster, and it's all and so on." And then when you see that kind of delta between what the top management says and what the middle management says, you say, "Okay, here obviously something is totally different." And the nice thing is that when you go through the various departments, you find that some departments have actually very good ethical track record, if you want, and then for others, this topic doesn't even seem to be existent. And if you want to know typically which ones, right? So to finance, they normally haven't heard about ethics at all. They know only compliance. Whatever is legal interests them, and the rest doesn't interest them at all. I would say the project management, this kind of functional roles, they are still the most aware of those.
Because we're integrated, we have to integrate with multiple departments.
Exactly. But then as you go to...
And I think you have to be an idealist to be a project manager.
But you go into engineering, and this becomes a very cynical crowd.
Yeah. But this is an important point, because I was alluding to the fact that you're working on a book, but you said something very important that we talked about before, but it slipped my mind. You don't just look at this as this subject as a plaything, as an academic project, but you actually do consulting and support companies in developing ethical models of leadership, right? And you mentioned that you have this survey. What are some of the metrics that this survey will give? What kind of, is there some? I'm assuming there's some kind of.
Yeah, I mean it's going to be a multiple choice survey that you can gain a number of points, right? And then we will have certain cutoff values for assessment. But the interesting thing here is that this actually goes back to a 15-year-old research about surveys, because many surveys are
self-serving.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they're not very how should I say? They're not very scientifically set up, and that is one point. And of course, there's a lot of science and a lot of research done in the marketing field for marketing surveys to tickle out the real information. But what people do not often take into account is that a survey, an employee survey, so management employee survey, is actually a strategic action that influences the system. So if you ask the employees something, and then they give an answer, and then they get the impression that nobody listens to this answer,
nobody cares.
You've actually made it worse, right? And also
you create more cynicism,
and it manages expectations. So many medium-sized to bigger enterprises use those surveys as a kind of hygiene factor. It's offered by my HR company who does
greenwashing, whitewashing.
Yeah, and then so we have our employee survey, and then they call it engagement survey. So we have engagement, but it's basically this hygiene factor, and they don't understand the strategic value of doing the survey. And you see, this is, by the way, what is important. If you do a survey in a company about ethics, I mean, the first reaction will be it's really negative. So what are they trying to test?
Until you prove that you mean it, that you're serious about it.
So the way you actually present this kind of first step, it's the first intervention, right? Is that survey. So it's not just an assessment tool where you can get your ISO whatever certification. You will never get a positive ethics evaluation from us, because we don't do that. Maybe the best score you can get from 0 to 1 is 0.4 or something like that.
I think also, if you're going to do an ethics survey, it has to be enveloped in things that people on different levels of the organization can understand. Because what is a mechanic on the production line is what ethics. You're going to have to put it in their language, and that is there equity, is there inclusion, is there fairness? Okay, do people listen to us when we speak? Is the company looking out for our best interest, or do I have the feeling that I'm being taken advantage of? How do you deal with, is overtime a legitimate thing that's being paid for? Do I get fair value? Am I participating in the overall benefit of the organization? If you talk ethics, it's abstract for a lot of people.
Correct. So the survey does include all these practical questions, and very important point that you just made, it is developed individually and with a systemic approach. Okay. So obviously not the same survey fits every company. So there's a sort of precursor phase where you develop the final questions, and also where you talk with top management about how to put this into practice. So but see, this is only the first intervention. But it's very important to understand this is already an intervention. The second intervention is then you analyze those results, and then you can have maybe some coaching or some.
You can develop countermeasures.
Countermeasures. But typically, those countermeasures would also start at the top, right? And they will involve exactly the things we already mentioned: the values, the habits, and the skills.
Okay. That's quite a big topic that you're working on in this studies that you're doing, which will eventually amount to a book.
Yes, I hope maybe in the fall
Okay.
it will come out, and
We'll bring you back and we'll see what's changed until then. We have a tradition in our podcast, two traditions. One, we ask you if there's, for people whose interest might be piqued, to say, listen, maybe I'm not convinced, or maybe I am convinced. Is there anything where I can kind of come up to speed? Where literature, are there any particular books on ethics and leadership that you would recommend to our viewers?
Well, I mean, I could recommend books by
like this long,
Immanuel Kant. And,
okay, yeah. So you're going
Aristotle.
for the, yeah.
But obviously, I mean, you do your own research when it comes to those questions.
Are there any modern books where you say that these are good?
Yeah, I mean,
good contemporary.
Yeah. I recommend one thing that is, I think, very interesting and sort of opens your mind to the whole also philanthropic and sort of this whole world of doing good is it's about effective altruism. So this is also a very interesting topic. The main idea here is that you try to make your positive contributions to society, you make them measurable, because many people, they give to charity, but they don't really ask any further questions, and maybe they look at some score of the organization where they give the charity to. Maybe that score is they are very trusted. They will not take your money and run, but really use it well. But typically, it is a percentage of how much of the money arrives at the actual people that you want to help. But they never measures if, once the money has arrived there, if it actually helped solve the problem that you want to solve. And effective altruism is all about that. I think doing better at doing good is one title that you should maybe look at. Mm-hmm. And I mean, interesting would be Basserman's book, which is called, I think, Better Not Perfect, where he basically says, okay, maybe perfection is the enemy of the good, right? Mm-hmm. So think about those incremental changes. And like, if you think about what I said, when you lose, don't lose too much. When you win a little bit more. This kind of
having some guiding principles that help you through the tough spots.
So basically work on the margin is a very good approach to sort of get going and to find real tangible results, even if they're not so big, but at least measurable results.
So incremental benefits and seeing the big picture. Okay.
Correct.
A second tradition that we have, I'm very proud of our film team. I always look to them to see how well the podcasts get. They're still awake, so that's a good sign. They're great because they don't have our background. They're more in the creative area and in the film area. Great people. Can highly recommend them if you need a film crew. But I always like to ask them if they have any questions of our guests, and they often come up with some of the best questions. Nelly, do you have any questions for our guest? So you're kind of alluding to the concept. The struggle that every new generation has is, how do they harness their idealism, which is a huge potential for society. If we could just embrace the potential of every new generation that comes up and kind of holds us accountable for the things that philosophers have been telling us for hundreds, if not thousands of years, versus the wearing down, the cynicism that's often vomited up on every new generation to keep them low. Shut up and listen. You don't know enough yet. So your question is kind of as a light fund, as a guideline for the new generations that are coming, and what can they do to have their idealism have a bigger impact? Yeah.
That doesn't matter.
That's a very good question, which I think has a very simple answer to, right? So because we were talking here about what the leadership can do, right? And I could tell you, well, you're powerless, and that's a fact. So you can't really do much, right? And obviously, we have very indirect ways of influencing society. We go to vote for a certain party, and it's very little what we can do. But of course, we also know that we can change the world around us. So
influence is often stronger than power.
It is really like the world, the immediate world that is around you. You can, of course, influence. And actually, one of the most influential advice I got as a teenager once from a father of a friend of mine. He said, I wanted to change the world, and I had these big ideas. I wanted to have a better world. And then he said, look, you can't influence the world. You can only influence, just imagine a radius of 1 kilometer around you, and that's what you can influence, but not more. Maybe within this kilometer, there's your school and, your friends. Beyond that, it's forget it, it's basically start there, maybe it grows and maybe you can really influence the world. And of course, today, it's all virtualized and digitized, but it's still that circle. It's still not much bigger, even if maybe the different points of that circle are very far away. And so what do we advise the leaders to do? Well, we advise them, work on yourself, hone your skills, work on your personality, work on your values, work on your habits, right? And that will change, because they are leaders, it will change the whole organization and our world. So that's exactly what you can do. You can do exactly the same thing. You can cultivate yourself. You can spend time on self-improvement. You can spend time on building your character and your values, and you can develop habits that make you into a person with who will have an effect on the whole environment. My feeling is people who do that, and my observation, they will become leaders eventually, and then they will be.
Yeah, because they stand out, and I think that's what the society is looking for. Trust. They're looking for people, and leaders aren't born from one moment to the other. They have to build over. They have to aggregate over time. I think this goes back to this classical what Stephen Covey once talked about. We all are overwhelmed by our circle of interest. If we look at the news, we get depressed and then we feel like inconsequential in the world because we say our circle of power is, but our true benefit is in what we call the circle of influence, is we only have so much power, but we have so much potential. And I would disagree with you a little bit. I think absolute revolution in our society today, and that you would agree with me with, I'm sure what this is concerned, is social media gives us much, much more potential in having influence on people. And I think what I would tell young people is if inconsequential nincompoops can be influencers on social media, you can too. You can have influence with positive things. I think the most important thing is don't let people rob your enthusiasm. I think I'm going on 60 here now soon. I'm still proud of the fact that I have a lot of the idealism that I had when I was younger. I remember when I was about 16, I had this conversation with one of my teachers, and she looked at me and she says, Mark, everything you're saying is incredibly well thought through but very idealistic. And she said to me, this was her advice, wait till you're a little bit older and reevaluate that. And my counter answer was, if what I'm saying now has validity and purpose, why should it change just because I get older? I think there's a trade-off factor. Sometimes you have to learn new things that you didn't know about beforehand to create a better. Coming back to this, that decisions require multiple facets, multiple perspectives to come up with the right solution. I have a big hope in the new generations, and I hope that they become more active, and I hope that they don't lose their energy, and I hope that life doesn't tear them down. I agree with you. There is sometimes a little bit too much entitlement. I think we in our generation, we're also entitled to a certain extent, but there's a lot of potential there. Thanks.
I think maybe this point about being an idealist, right? I think when we get older, we do have to acknowledge that we learn more things, and it is to be expected that we change our opinion. Yeah. And as we accumulate negative experiences in a very dynamic world, maybe we become more cynical. And I can tell you about myself that I'm much more cynical than I used to be as a young person. And I have learned about the nature of man being really terrible. Mm-hmm. And I had a much higher opinion of human beings before. And yet, actually, that is only one step in the step of enlightenment. When you think it further, the question is, how do you react to that, right? And you can always say, okay, I'm a victim of the external circumstances. But as Viktor Frankl says, and as the Stoics already say, Epictetus says the same, you are in complete control of how you react to it. Yeah. So you can, and then that is, you can decide what your reaction is. And that means you can shape your own reality to a large extent. And of course, it is important what your reaction is. If your reaction is again cynical and I destroy myself or escapism and what have you,
nihilistic.
Then who am I to judge? Obviously, that is also a possibility. But as you pursue a path of self-improvement and of enlightenment and of being and then listening to others and this kind of broadening your horizon, you will see the cynicism actually wears off, because among all these terrible people you will meet there, you will also meet some really great people who will inspire you and who will show you that they can do things.
And so really cynical you can't be if you still said that in this stage of your life, ethics and leadership is something that's important to you. So
that's how I react.
Good. Rico, do you have any questions?
Yeah. So I think I have an answer for you. So sometimes I'm reminded of what was the world like 90 years ago or so, or 90, 100 years ago, when basically the 20s still okay, but in the 1930s it got really dark in the world, right? And irrationalism and meanness and cruelty were the dominant factors in our world politics and in our society.
Or the status quo.
And then we descended into the abyss of the Holocaust and the one of the most destructive wars of mankind. So there's a descent to this kind of disaster right now, driven by exactly the factors that you mentioned. And I don't know if it's inevitable. I don't know if you can mitigate it. My gut feeling or my analysis tells me there's very little we can do about it. It's the zeitgeist, as we say, and we're going to descend into a new age of barbarism and brutality. And then we will, afterwards, if we haven't destroyed our entire planet, we will wake up and we'll try to do it. We'll try again, like we did after the Second World War. We'll try to build up a new version. And I think it will be better than the previous one. And that's, I think, pretty much how the world goes.
So you're talking about cycles. I wouldn't see it quite that dark. I think it's your question is similar to Nellie's. I think the answer is you don't know what you really believe, what you really believe, until your beliefs are challenged. So if you are against bullying, how do you deal with it? So it goes back to that Viktor Frankl or Epictetus thing. We don't have a choice of all the things that happen to us, the inputs that we get, but we do have an ultimate choice of how we deal with them. And I think in the sense of cynicism is do we stick to our team or do we join the others because we don't see a purpose or in believing what we believe anymore. I think that's ultimately what's going to happen. And I think what we should always remember is that also in times of darkness, if you want light, light a match, light a candle, and that match or candle might seem like an inconsequential thing. That's you. Okay, I believe in the sense of system theory, a swarm theory. I think we as individuals might not be as powerful as we think, but we're much more influential than we think. And the question is, are we willing to burn for what we believe in? I think that's ultimately the fuel behind ethics and leadership. And I agree with you. I think ultimately, I think Winston Churchill once said about the American population, you can apply this to, Winston Churchill once said about Americans, you can count on American people, always count on them doing the right thing after they've tried everything else. That is unfortunately the learning process in the cycle of history. Unfortunately, history repeats itself often, but I think I'm positive in the sense that there's, with enough consciousness and awareness of individuals that hold up against it, I think we have a good chance. So I want to leave on a light note. Sascha, I want to say thanks a lot for this extended conversation. I'm sure we could have gone on quite some more time. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to revisit it once you've finished your work in fall. Thanks a lot for entertaining our viewers and spectators. If you have questions, or you're interested in Sascha's services, or you want to contribute, or you have great cases, or you're interested in his survey process and his metrics, we'll put his contact information in the space below. Sascha, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.